This is a perfect case where I could say I liked it, but I wish I loved it. For this video, I'm going to give a broad summarization on my thoughts and opinions about this series, and some of its 49 episodes. Don't worry, I know you guys have better things to do than listen to me talk all day. So if this is the first video of mine you're watching, I do suggest you go watch the show first, spoilers ahead. Or you could also go watch all 49 of my video reviews, neither one works. I'll try to bring up as many new talking points as I can, stuff that never occurred to me while writing up the original weekly reviews. It happens when you gotta write the stuff in a timely fashion. And of course, thoughts that occurred to me in hindsight. Also, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to try and do all of this in chronological order as much as possible, and break it down into arcs, mostly based off of who was the major antagonist of each, since they did play the most significant part in the varying quality of this show's writing. And just to give you a quick idea of what's coming up, strong initial arcs, not quite as good preceding arcs, then really not as good latter middle arcs, but an ending that, upon reflection, is a little better than I remember. But for now, let's just start with the first two arcs, the Charlie and Rue arcs. Hugtto Precure probably had one of the strongest first halves of any Precure series. It established its world and characters well, gave us some very memorable moments ranging from emotional, hysterical, and even inspiring in parts. In spite of what would happen to most of these characters later, it's hard to argue that they didn't at least get some strong introductions that even kind of planted some possible seeds for later. Still, the high point of this first half, more so than even the reformation of Rue, was the reformation of Charlie. Of all the villains in this show, Charlie was my personal favorite. I don't really count Rue since she became a Six Ranger, as well as some other middling details that we'll get into. But he did get a lot of characterization over these first 11 episodes. Sure, we didn't see him for a few episodes when Purple took his place, but just seeing his fear and anxiety of what was going to happen to him made it clear that he wasn't going to a happy place. Originally, I theorized he had been sent to work for EA as punishment, but upon learning his boss's taste, I'm starting to think that maybe he was sent to Bethesda instead. Ugh. Working PR there would drain the will to live out of even the strongest of souls. And that it did, as he became the first general to turn into an Oshimaida. And in hindsight, I kind of really hate the fact that this became a thing for almost every villain. While I wouldn't say the concept of the one-winged angel is an inherently bad trope, I think Akiba Red put it best. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves just yet, and focus on this first arc and its great conclusion. In the original review, I did snark about how Hana essentially traded in the Star Saber for a much more advertiser-friendly product, but regardless, this scene is still a great representation of what the Precure stand for. While brute force is a significant part of their repertoire and should never be removed, their best weapon will always be their kindness and empathy towards everyone, friend and foe alike. As a result, Charlie, a villain that they managed to generate a decent amount of sympathy for, got the happy ending he deserved. And by that, I mean he joined the ranks of the underpaid and often very pretentious YouTuber crowd, but hey, whatever makes the guy happy, right? And now I feel very depressed right now. This was then followed up by the second best arc, the Ruru arc. Yeah, just take note of this declining pattern. We're going to see a lot more of it throughout this video. Don't get me wrong, I still really like this arc, as it even has a couple of my personal favorite episodes back to back with episodes 15 and 16. Yet, in spite of having the best comedic and animated episodes respectively, this arc, in my opinion, lost out to its immediate predecessor because of one significant little detail. Give you a hint, it's in the title. Don't get me wrong, I don't necessarily dislike our resident android, and do think she earned the same vocal talents that made Nanoha Takamachi the most destructive magical girl ever. But for the longest time, something about her character bothered me. It didn't really hit me until I read the Kamikita Futago's manga. And just in case anyone out there hasn't seen my Precure manga reviews, which you should, the Precure manga take place in their own universes, so the authors are able to take more than their fair share of creative liberties. This included actually giving more robotic traits to Ruru, both for comedic as well as dramatic effect. Meanwhile, anime Ruru, while exhibiting some robotic traits, often acted a bit too human at times, and don't even bring that Shock in here, she wasn't that bad. But yeah, while I'm not against Ruru becoming more human, in fact I think that would be a great arc for her to go through, they kind of rushed through it. And get used to me saying that a whole lot more throughout this video as well. Though, one kind of filler episode I want to point out from this arc is episode 14. It's by no means all that great, and as we know through the power of hindsight, it led to one of the least desirable twists of the season, but I do think it led to some positives that I will bring up later. And to be fair, it also introduced us to Rita Yoshimi, who, thanks mostly to her actress Kintaro, became one of the better supporting characters.
もうすぐファッションショーなのにアイディアが浮かばない。
I award points for dedication at least. Sadly, while this arc did end on a high note, it would be followed up by the slow downfall of the show. We then entered into the purple arc that also happened to be the 6th Ranger arc. I know a lot of people have been asking me for a follow-up to my 6th Ranger Precure review, which I might do in the near future, and when I do, I have a lot of things to say about these two. What I will say right now is that this arc left these two totally exposed. One thing this show, and by extension its main writer, really needed to learn was the importance of the concept of less is more. As I said, the biggest downfall of Ruru's character was giving her too much humanity too early. As a result, in spite of the fact that this was the part of the show where she became a Precure, her character kind of stagnated, and yet they still gave her a lot of screen time. Which, now that I think about it, one thing that might have been able to save this arc, as well as help the show in the long run, might have been not to let Ruru become a 6th Ranger. Until later. Let me finish. In episode 40, we learned that Emu was in fact always meant to be the owner of the 4th Pre-Heart. So then, why not just go with that and not let this clip go to waste? Have Emu through her own efforts become a Precure while also slowly developing a partnership with Ruru. You could still have Ruru be a part of Purple's reformation scene, yeah don't worry I haven't forgotten about her, but have her be in her civilian form. Then in the next arc, you could have Ruru get a Pre-Heart, not through a total Deus Ex Machina, but by reverse engineering Emu's Pre-Heart. Hey, if Sebastian can make a decent bootleg transformation trinket, I don't see why the robot from the future couldn't do likewise. You could even justify it by saying that it's codependent on Emu's original. Save a legitimately great scene like this for a little later in the show. But alas, some things were just not meant to come to pass. This arc also suffered from its underusage of its established characters, with Saya and Homari just off-screen taking major steps in their career paths in a show about working towards a better future. But then I guess we would lose out on time focused on the 6 Rangers and Henri. Okay, this is a can of worms I really don't want to open, so all I'll say is that as a character, I honestly have little against Henri. I do think some of the reception he got was a little unearned. Cure waffles for life. But otherwise, I don't have that much against him, other than that he got a little too much screen time for a side character. Sadly, as we'll see throughout this series, head writer Fumi Tsuboda, on top of having a preference for characters of a particular design, has the mentality of a child who just got a new toy and will throw an old one to the side, even though there's absolutely nothing wrong with it and it deserves more attention. Seriously, I don't care what anyone else says. This is the best design for Soundwave ever. All of that said, there was a bright spot to all of this in the form of a lady who spoke with lingo surprisingly less relevant than mine. Purple was probably my second favorite villain, as while not quite as sympathetic as Charlie, she was a fairly interesting and tragic character in her own right. Helped by her being a representation of one of Japan's most unfortunate periods, the bubble economy era. I'll bring this more up later, including how they dropped the ball with it, but I really did like the idea of having some of the major antagonists of the series represent different economic periods of Japan. Purple got the most literal interpretation, both in her design representing the hostesses of the nightclubs that became popular during the era, and in her arc. Well, she managed to ride high for a little while, like the many Japanese companies who benefit from the influx of trade from foreign markets. It wasn't long before the bomb dropped and the next era, the Lost Decade, or in this show's case, Jealous, came in to clean up the messes she made. This was really interesting stuff in my opinion. I mean, as much as I like Charlie, I do think there was a ceiling to his character since he didn't have anyone to work off of, which went with his character, but more on that later. Purple, on the other hand, now had a very meta rival, and they could have gone in very interesting directions with these two. Sadly, she would soon be jobbed out to the Six Rangers, as well as the powers that be who needed to promote their autumn movie.
That was dramatic.
For one episode, the original Futari duo were brought in thanks to a portal made by the Magic Baby. All of these toddlers really need day 1 patches to nerf them. They came in, gave rubs to the nearest cures, and did most of the legwork during the final fight with Purple. Yeah, with all due respect to the OG duo, Nagisa and Honoka being brought in like this felt very superfluous, as it was just blatant promotion for the autumn crossover movie, which was now all of a sudden an All-Stars movie? What? Okay, so this is just my own crazy little conspiracy theory, so feel free to take it with a huge pinch of salt. Based on my research, Hugtto was doing well with its ratings and toy sales, so it really didn't need this extra push. Heck, compared to its Tokusatsu brothers, it was doing really well. Which, therein lies the problem. While I did like Build overall, I will admit its final act kinda fell flat, and so did its Q4 toy sales. Meanwhile, Lupin Ranger vs. Power Rangers first quarter toy sales brought in some of the franchise's lowest returns to date. Toei likely got the disappointing numbers around the time the Ruru arc was wrapping up. So to make up for it, they probably decided to amp up promoting their other big cash cow, even turning what was supposed to be a 2-team movie into a Guinness-worthy All-Stars movie. Sorry, I know I kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent there. I just really wanted to include that Sentai stuff because I do think it's an interesting little theory. Also, I'm just praying that Toei can learn from this the next time they try and do a Versus series again. Seriously, the Power Rangers deserve so much better. Now all that said, would have excluding the Futari duel have rescued the conclusion to this arc? Honestly, based on what we had seen so far and what we would see later, I would have to say, probably not. I have little doubt that Purple still would have been jobbed out to Emu and Ruru around this time. So while Honoka and Nagisa doing most of the physical work during the fight was irksome, it wouldn't have changed the fact that they were closing Purple's arc prematurely. So, while I do think excluding the Futari duel from this arc would have improved it, that's like saying the extended cut improves Batman v Superman. Yes, it gives the story a little bit more sense and cohesiveness, but still Batman v Superman. I will praise this arc for one thing, at least they took out Purple in the most fitting way for what her character represented. They did by having Jealous, remember the representation of the Lost Decade, being chosen over her by George, in bed. Because remember, Precure is a show designed for impressionable little girls. I mean, okay, they don't actually show anything, but it's still very strongly implied, and Purple's reaction to it was essentially staged like a suicide right out of one of the endings to School Days. This series went to some really dark places at times, and yet it didn't feel too excessive, so kudos there. While I do think the conclusion to this arc was rushed a little, at least it went out on a high note. And with the exception of this show's final episode, that's the last time you'll hear me say high note in this video. On to the next arc. This was the arc where Georgie Boy started taking a more active role, revealing that he was the president of Cryasu. Also, this arc really should have belonged to Daigon and his fantastic monkey dance, but... While I could get over Purple's dismissal from Cryasu, this was just uncalled for. Now originally, I wasn't that much against this twist, as I thought it was a good way of getting Dr. Traum over as a legit threat. But, through the power of hindsight and everything... yeah, not really worth it. Daigon would at least go on to becoming a minor fan favorite for a very niche group who like their memes, but it was clear they had no plans for him, mostly because of Fumi Tsuboda and her taste. I think she's really into the Sojiro types. Which... I understand, but come on, give the monkey dancer a chance. While he was entertaining at times with his meta humor, Dr. Tron probably had the most incomplete arc of all of the remaining village, which was no easy task considering who was left on the table. But yeah, as a villain, he was mostly just a prankster with no real depth to him other than a few minute connections to his robot daughter Ruru, which didn't really get brought up until after he reformed. Also, even though I do consider this to be the trauma arc, truth be told, he actually took a back seat for many of these episodes, as all of the remaining villains were competing for screen time. This ties back to Fumi Tsuboda's new toy mentality I brought up, as in spite of already personifying every post-war economy period, she decided to throw in not one, but two more villains onto the pile, Dr. Trom and Bishin. Honestly, just adding one of these villains would have been intrusive, but not detrimental to the plot. In fact, they could have given much needed development to either Ruru or Harry respectively. But nope, I guess someone decided to take a page out of the Bleach handbook and just threw in both villains for the heck of it without a lot of plans set for them. Now, as for the arc itself, I think the best way I can describe it is the good, the bad, and the huh? Basically, it was a very mixed arc with some great episodes like 29's heart-wrencher of Hana's grandmother coming to terms with her advancing age, crimes against nature like 28,
dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria,
and episodes like 24 and 25 that make you go, wait, Hana was a bully victim and has PTSD now?
Well, there it is.
I guess in a sense you could consider this to be the most engaging arc in the series, as almost every week brought something new to the table, for better or worse. Probably for the worse. They also tried to use this arc to give more characterization to Homari and Saya after pretty much ignoring them in the last arc. For the former, it kind of worked. They at least advanced Homari's relationship with Harry and gave her a fun Little Mermaid episode. For the latter, is the Blue Doctor considered to be a stereotype if almost everyone is doing it? Okay, I know I'm exaggerating, but it is still unfortunate that this is the part of the series where they decided to begin Saya's arc of shifting from acting to medicine. Now, in some ways, I'm not totally against this idea, as I do think it's important to teach this show's target audience that having a little bit of flexibility when it comes to your dreams isn't always a bad thing. Our interests change, and sometimes we just find that we're naturally better fitted for other professions. It happens. However, from a pure storytelling perspective, this was a severe detriment to Saya's character, as we simply weren't given enough material to actually care about her as a character. Up until this point in the show, she hadn't gotten many focus episodes, and the few she did get were more in relation to her situation rather than the girl herself. I dare say one chapter of the manga gave her more development than the handful of episodes she had gotten up to this point. At least there, we got a plausible explanation on why she's a tech junkie. Now don't get me wrong, I don't dislike Saya, and I do like some of her episodes here, like 35, where she helped to resolve some waning tensions between a daughter and a mother who was about to have a C-section, which they really went into depth about. Jeez, this show is really obsessed with babies and childbirth. I wonder if it's building up to something. Point is, while being kind-hearted and understanding is great, Saya is simply not interesting enough of a character to pull off a job change twist like this. You're a nice role model, Saya, but not quite enough of a character to actually make us care. And then there's the issue of the actually plot-relevant episodes. Let's start with the mid-season upgrade episode. The memorial clock came as a result of Hana resolving her past bully issues, which, okay, while every situation is different, on average, I really don't think they can be resolved in the length of one anime episode, and especially not bullying that forced her to transfer schools. It just doesn't make for interesting storytelling when it's handled this haphazardly. And let's not even get into the fact that the first usage of this upgrade were against some no-name butlers. The less I have to be reminded of the fact that the unfighting dad from Gold Stranger is still getting work, the happier I'll be. Then, of course, there was the big big crossover that just so happened to double as an advertisement for the upcoming movie. As I say in the review proper, from a strictly spectacle standpoint, this was fantastic. Viewers got to watch a condensed All-Stars movie on free TV. That's actually quite nice. But for this show at large... Yeah, what did the final boss of this show look like? And what did this arc villain, who was mostly built up as a comedy act, look like? Call me crazy, but I'm just sensing a slight discrepancy here, guys. Also, there was that little aforementioned issue of Trom being Ruru's career that they were only now tying things back to. Oh well, I guess they could just force that development into parts of the final, and unfortunately, most disjointed arc of the series. Yeah, I'm really just defaulting on referring to this as the George arc, as pretty much all of the other class execs had been booked into irrelevance due to their sparse usage during this latter half of the series. With only 12 episodes left, they had almost no time for much development between the three of them and their boss. And the second they did start to develop somewhat of a character, chances were fairly good that they would just as quickly be defeated and reformed. Well, at least they pulled the bandage off quickly! Ow! The worst of these were easily Harry's hamster buddies, as they barely paid any lip service to them and the hamster community they all came from. Like, are these guys really fairies, or are they just really intelligent hamsters? As someone who grew up watching Disney, I'd be willing to accept either explanation. But nope, barely even half an episode, and I guess we're just supposed to fill in the blanks ourselves. Now, to be fair, there were some interesting developments, like Risto willingly returning to the dark side even after being purified, showing that he was too far gone at this point. Though apparently not quite far gone enough, as a little time from Harry managed to bring him back. Heck, they even had enough time in that same episode to make it a 2-for-1 with Bishin, who was built up as easily the most unhinged of the Kryasu execs. This show tried to build up these characters, and yet in this latter half of the series, they fumbled the ball every single time. It's almost as if the show just has some weird obsession with shooting itself in the foot. I really need to stop it with this self-inflicted slapstick shtick. Then again, maybe this drop in quality shouldn't have been that surprising, as after a Halloween filler, the remainder of the series was written solely by Fumi Tsuboda. Which, even if we were to put aside all of her really poor story choices up until this point, that's just plain crazy. I don't know if Tsuboda herself insisted she go it alone, or if there were some complications behind the scenes. I'm kind of leaning towards the former. But either way, it's a very impractical way of closing out a long-running anime, as after a while, things will start to all feel the same if it's all just being helmed by one writer. And that's pretty much what happened. As some of my commenters pointed out, these final episodes all kind of became a chain of melodramas. Now granted, I am kind of a sucker for drama, and some of it I did think was legitimately good, like Henri's car accident. He may have been able to become the supposed first male Precure ever, but he also had to suffer from the fact that he would never be able to perform again. They rightfully never reversed his twist, and thus when we got to see him find a new passion as a coordinator, it felt that much more triumphant. However, while self-contained stories like that can be great, they can't really act as the building blocks to a continuous narrative, which is the greatest flaw in Tsuboda's writing. Some of her one-shot works can be pretty great, and that's probably what attracted some of the Toei higher-ups. But actual serialization is definitely not her forte. She simply didn't have the patience nor the focus needed to produce a series-long narrative. Now, to be fair, this problem isn't exclusive to just her. Even though I like many of her comedy episodes, I really don't think Yoshimi Narita should ever be the head writer, or else we get series with very convoluted love triangles. And of course, the inverse can be true too. Shoji Yonemura can be a good writer as long as he's given space to work. Ask him to make something like a self-contained film and yeah, I think I've already made my point. It's kind of like the difference between a sprint and a marathon runner, which Tsuboda definitely fell into the former. So yeah, Tsuboda's overall performance was very lackluster, to say the least, with this final set of episodes emphasizing that point. Would I call her the worst Precure writer ever? I would, had Yuko Kakihara not written a few episodes afresh and completely ruined Miki's character. Let's hope she doesn't come back for the tri-sequel. With the exception of the ending, which we will cover in just a bit, there's really not much else I can say about this arc that I didn't already get out in my reviews proper. I still, for the life of me, can't fully process the everyone is a Precure scene, so I think for the sake of all of our sanity, let's start wrapping things up. Hugtto was a series of two halves. It had some great ideas, and some good build-up, but as it went along, the execution really started to falter, to the point that the majority of its plot resolutions really just became almost laughably bad. You may have noticed I brought up the villains a lot throughout this video, and that's mainly because I found it fascinating that most of them were essentially personifications of different economic periods in Japan. The Meiji Restoration, the Industrial Revolution, the Baby Boomers, the Bubble Economy, the Lost Decade, and even the current Millennial period. As somebody who majored in Japanese and minored in business, I especially found the story of Japan's post-war economy to be absolutely fascinating, like almost something out of a classic hero's journey. Even though in this case, it was used by the villains.
Weird how things work out like that.
And in a show where the main theme is the future, this is probably the most ideal way of exemplifying George Santayana's timeless quote. I was really invested in this stuff.
So I guess it was only appropriate that after the character who represented the bubble economy was defeated, that the show's writing would go south. Was this actually planned out?
But yeah, once the writing for the antagonist started to fall apart, the protagonist would soon follow suit. Again, I didn't actually dislike any of the Precure of this series. They remained amiable and often very selfless heroines. It was just a severe lack of proper character building that really diminished their values. They either got too little focus, too much focus, without really adding that much new to them each time, or they just got kind of random traits added onto them out of nowhere. This show had many great ideas for its characters and world that I loved, so it really hurt when they squandered such great opportunities.
By the end of the series, I was left so conflicted that I couldn't even really process how I felt about this ending. And yet, after some discussions with a friend of mine on Instagram, as well as some recent events in my own life, I think I actually really love this ending.
Again, this is just gonna be my own little conspiracy theory about the show, but hear me out. While we never confirmed whether or not Hana ever ended up with George at the end of the series, I've heard the wedding dress was meant to represent her being married to her job, we do know at the very least that the George Kurai who created Kuraiasu was motivated by her death. Word from Tsuboda herself seems to suggest this particular version of Hana committed suicide, but over what exactly?
Well, for that, I think the answer lies in a different timeline.
In my final episode review, I theorized the show went by DBZS multiverse rules. Thus, I believe we can divide the timelines into three. George's original timeline that became a desolate wasteland, Cure Tomorrow's timeline that he invaded and froze, and the main timeline that we stayed in for almost the entire series. We know now that Cure Tomorrow was actually Hana's daughter Hugmi, and yet even after returning to her timeline, she didn't reunite with her actual mother. She only called out to her while looking up at the sky, suggesting that her version of Hana had already passed on, though I think for different reasons than the one from George's timeline. Also, consider this, throughout the series, they really took the time to talk about the importance of safe childbirth and raising said child.
They put so much focus on it that you'd almost think it was the key to saving the world or something. Well, maybe it was.
Perhaps the reason the first Hana committed suicide was because her child was a stillborn. Then in Cure Tomorrow's world, Hana died while giving birth. Perhaps this is what drove George into true despair. The fact that no matter what the scenario, Hana Nono would be unable to spend a happy future with her daughter as at least one of them was destined to pass on. And yet, in an ironic twist, he ended up unintentionally giving Hugmi the opportunity to right this wrong. At the end of the series, Hana managed to safely give birth to her daughter because it was a much different setup than in previous timelines. Obviously, she was a much stronger person physically and mentally due to her tenure as a Precure, but more importantly, she now had two strong friends she didn't have in the original timelines. A doctor who had set aside an operating room just for her, and a world-class athlete giving her the strongest moral support possible. Had Hugmi not traveled back in time and set in motion the events of this series, these three likely would have never met, and at least two of them wouldn't have their current occupations. Sai would have remained an actress, and Homari would have never returned to the ice.
Now I know, I'm basically just spying off my own headcanon at this point, but I just find it to be such an interesting interpretation.
It turns the series into the story of a young girl's journey towards adulthood, and through the efforts of all of her friends and allies, she managed to create a path towards the brightest future possible that she otherwise would have never reached had her original destiny played out. And even if I'm completely wrong about all of this, which I'm not denying that possibility, I think I still would have really fallen in love with this ending.
And just for this one part, I want to talk real for a minute. So, shortly after this episode aired and I posted my original review, I got some amazing news from my sister. Apparently, within about half a year, I'm going to be an uncle.
For somebody like me who had never had any intentions of having kids, this was groundbreaking stuff. I immediately volunteered to help raise her child because I know my sister's going to be busy with her job, as ironically enough, she's going to become a pediatrician. She told me I didn't have to, but I insisted. And after rewatching this ending, I realized I made the right choice.
Very soon, the future isn't going to belong to just us, and we need to start building a better one for the next generation.
In spite of its many flaws, this show still managed to deliver that message amazingly well with just this final shot. As a series that was meant to help close out Japan's Heisei era, I can't think of a better note to close out on.
Hugtto by no means was a perfect series. At best, I'd say it was above average.
In my books, it'll never be superior than the OG, Heartcatch, or even Princess. It just had too many flaws in its writing for me to consider it great. However, when it did hit the mark, it truly did shine. And this ending in particular is something I'll hold close to me in the years to come.
Thank you to everyone for sticking around through all of my ramblings. Next time I'll return with the Doki Doki reviews, so I'll look forward to that. If you want to keep updated on my stuff, feel free to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I'll leave links below. And until next time though, farewell for now my friends, and let us all look forward to some much brighter futures ahead.